man in the casket wasn't him. Sinatra's bodyguard breaks 27-year silence. The man who kidnapped Sinatra's son and made millions. For 52 years, Frank Sinatra Jr. tried to prove he wasn't a fraud. He died in 2016, still trying. The three men who kidnapped him walked free in under 5 years, and one of them ended up a millionaire. Frank Jr. never got that lucky. It all traces back to a snowy night in Lake Tahoe, room 417. Or Frank Sinatra could throw money at almost any problem. When his 19-year-old son got kidnapped at gunpoint in 1963, he offered $1 million. The kidnappers demanded less. They wanted $240,000, and Sinatra paid it. He got his boy back in 54 hours. It all traces back to room 417 in Lake Tahoe. Or a blizzard is hammering South Lake Tahoe. Frank Sinatra Jr. is 19, half-dressed, eating chicken before his 10 p.m. show. He's a kid trying to sing out from under his father's shadow. Somebody's about to knock on his door with a lie about a package. Every accusation that follows him to the grave starts inside room 417. So back up to December 8th, 1963, and room 417. Frank Jr. is 19 years old, and this is the night that ruins the rest of his life. He's the son of the most famous singer on planet Earth, and he's trying to sing too. He's booked at Harrah's club up in State Line, Nevada, singing with what's left of the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra. Same band his dad made his name in 20 years earlier. Even the gig feels borrowed. It's a Sunday night. The snow's coming down so hard the airport already shut. Inside room 417, Frank Jr. is sitting there in a T-shirt and underwear, eating chicken with the band's trumpet player, John Foss. His 10 o'clock show is still an hour away. Then somebody knocks on the door. The voice on the other side says he's got a package. Frank Jr. cracks the door open. 2 guys walk in with revolvers already out. They tape Foss to a chair, throw a coat over Frank Jr.'s bare shoulders, blindfold him, and walk him out a side door into the snow. That whole kidnapping takes 60 seconds. 60 seconds later, the room is empty, and Sinatra's son is gone. But here's the twist nobody's ready for. The 2 guys carrying him out aren't the mob. One of them is Barry Keenan, 23 years old, and best friends with Frank Jr.'s older sister Nancy back in high school. He used to eat dinner at the Sinatra house. At 21, he was the youngest guy trading on the Los Angeles Stock Exchange. Then he got into a bad car accident, got put on painkillers, and the painkillers slowly rewired him. His partner is Joe Amsler, 23 years old, an abalone diver up the California coast, former amateur boxer, and a broke high school buddy of Keenan's. And there's a third guy waiting back at the hideout named John Irwin. That's the whole team. Nobody in the Chicago outfit. Just 2 broke guys and a mess who cooked up a kidnapping on Percodan. Meanwhile, the FBI's already on the case. Foss chews through the tape in about 10 minutes and calls hotel security. By 9:40 at night, agents are on the ground. Roadblocks go up around the whole lake. And here's where the story gets ridiculous. The kidnappers actually get pulled over at one of those roadblocks, in their Chevy Impala, with a blindfolded teenager on the floor of the back seat, and the cop lets them go. They talk their way through it, wave and drive off into the snow, with Frank Sinatra's son still tied up in their car. Then the phone rings at the Sinatra house down in Palm Springs. Frank Sr. was in the middle of filming Robin and the 7 Hoods with Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. He dropped everything and flew to Reno because Tahoe Airport was buried. From Reno, he tried to drive over Spooner Summit. The pass was closed. Half the roads were closed, so he gave up. He got a suite at the Malps Hotel and sat there waiting for the phone to ring. Then the offers started rolling in from people he probably wished hadn't called. Bobby Kennedy, the Attorney General, offered help. Sam Giancana, the boss of the Chicago mob, offered help too. Frank Sr. said thanks and told both of them no. He handed the whole thing to the FBI instead. That one call tells you everything about how scared he was. But the kidnappers don't want $1 million. They want less than half of that. 240,000 is the number. Nobody could figure out why at first, and the truth is honestly funnier than the crime. Keenan didn't want $1 million because he thought $1 million was too greedy. He was on Percodan, drinking, hearing voices, and he talked himself into thinking the whole kidnapping was actually a favor to the Sinatras. His plan was to invest the ransom, make the money back on the stock market, and pay Frank Sr. back later. In his head, this wasn't a crime. It was a business loan he forgot to ask for out loud. There was one more rule the kidnappers laid down. Every conversation with Frank Sr. had to happen on a payphone. That was their whole system for staying safe. And this one detail is going to follow Frank Sr. all the way to his grave. Starting that Sunday night, for the next 35 years, he carried 10 dimes with him everywhere he went. 10 dimes, always, in a pocket, just in case somebody in his family disappeared again and he needed a phone booth in a hurry. Hold on to those 10 dimes. They're going to close this whole story out. So the FBI set the drop for Sepulveda Boulevard. Frank Jr. was being kept in a small house out in Canoga Park. He was blindfolded almost the whole time. The kidnappers kept switching who did the talking, so he couldn't pick out voices later. On the outside, Frank Sr. handed the FBI a suitcase packed with $240,000 in cash. Here's the move that killed the whole plan before it got off the ground. The FBI photographed every single bill in that suitcase before it went out the door. That suitcase was a bomb the second it left Frank Sr.'s hands. The kidnappers just didn't know it yet. Very early on December 11th, an FBI agent pulled up to Sepulveda Boulevard and dropped the suitcase between 2 parked school buses. Keenan and Amsler rolled up, grabbed the bag, and disappeared into the dark. $240,000 in cash, right there in the middle of the night, and no cops in sight. But while those two were picking up the money, the third kidnapper back at the house was cracking. John Irwin had been babysitting Frank Jr. the whole time, and something in him wouldn't let him finish the job. So before Keenan even made it home with the cash, Irwin put Frank Jr. in a car, drove out to Bel Air, and let him out on the side of the road, a few blocks from his mother Nancy's house. Frank Jr. was walking down a street in Bel Air at 3 a.m, alone, blindfold gone. A private security guard found him, and what that guard did next tells you exactly how obsessed the country already was with this kid. He didn't put Frank Jr. in the back seat. He put him in the trunk of his patrol car. Because photographers were everywhere, and the second one of them saw Frank Jr. alive, the story was over. Sinatra's son got driven home in a trunk to hide him from cameras. Meanwhile, Keenan and Amsler were back in a rented Culver City apartment, throwing bills up in the air like it was a bad heist movie. They thought they'd won. They had no idea they had about 72 hours of freedom left. The whole thing fell apart because one man couldn't shut up. The FBI had the marked bills. They had fingerprints from the Tahoe room. They had John Foss's description of both kidnappers. None of that is what actually broke the case. What broke it was the mouth of one of the kidnappers. John Irwin, the guy who'd let Frank Jr. go, couldn't sit on the story. He told his own brother, just bragged about it, because he needed somebody in the world to know he'd been part of the biggest kidnapping in America since the Lindbergh baby. His brother thought about it for about a day, then picked up the phone and called the FBI. Within days of the drop, all three of them were in cuffs. When the FBI raided Amsler's apartment, they found roughly $168,000 of the ransom stuffed inside. Keenan was picked up a day later with more of it on him. Almost all the money was recovered in the end, but not quite all of it. What happened to the last bit has never been fully explained. Now, if the story ended right here, this would just be a fast, dumb crime with a happy ending. But then the FBI opened a safe deposit box that Keenan kept in a bank in Los Angeles, and what was in that box changed the whole story. Inside, sitting under a pile of paperwork, was a letter Barry Keenan had written to his own parents before the kidnapping ever happened. That same box. More of the ransom cash, sitting right there beside the letter. But Keenan wasn't the only person on the paperwork for that box. There was a second name on it, and it was a name people actually knew. That's where Dean Torrance walked in. Dean Torrance was one half of Jane and Dean, Surf, Sun, Surf City, Dead Man's Curve, a top 10 pop act on the radio that whole year. He was a squeaky clean American teen idol. He also happened to have gone to University High in Los Angeles with Barry Keenan and Frank Jr.'s sister Nancy. Same school, same year, same lunch tables. Federal agents pulled about $1,870 of Sinatra ransom money right out of Torrance's shared box. Torrance got called to the stand. He swore he had no idea about the kidnapping in advance. Then later, at the same trial, he took it back. He told the judge he'd lied. He'd known the whole time. Not only did he know, he'd loaned Keenan $500 in seed money to help get the plan off the ground. Torrance somehow dodged perjury charges, but Jan and Dean's momentum took a huge hit after that. Their next few singles flopped. A career built on beaches and blondes doesn't survive being tied to Sinatra ransom money. That isn't even the worst betrayal in this story, though. The worst one happens inside the courtroom. So the trial opened on February 10th, 1964. The three defendants shared a lawyer, and that lawyer was somebody. Her name was Gladys Towles Root, and in 1964, she was the most famous female criminal defense attorney on the West Coast. She walked into courtrooms wearing giant feathered hats, tight dresses, fur coats, and long gloves. She'd built her career on murder cases and sex crimes, and she chewed up witnesses on the stand for a living. Nobody in Los Angeles wanted to be on the other side of her. Now she was defending three guys who'd literally kidnapped a teenager at gunpoint on a snowy Sunday night in front of a trumpet player who identified all three of them. She had almost nothing. The FBI had the marked bills, the pre-written confession letter, the fingerprints, Torrance's testimony, and Frank Jr. himself on the stand, walking the jury through his own kidnapping. So Root swung for the fences. She stood in front of the jury and argued that Frank Jr. was in on the whole thing, that the entire kidnapping was a publicity stunt cooked up by the Sinatra family to boost his singing career, and that her clients were basically hired actors playing the kidnappers. She stood there and asked, and this is her exact recorded line, was this the publicity he had been looking for, to make ladies swoon over him like Papa? It was a 19-year-old kid getting called a fraud in his own kidnapping trial in front of the whole country. Every newspaper picked up that line the next morning. It was the kind of one-liner reporters would repeat forever, because it was small and mean, and it fit in a headline. Root wasn't really trying to prove Frank Jr. did it. She just needed enough smoke to give one juror a reason to hesitate. She didn't get it, but she planted the seed anyway. On paper, all three were going away forever. In real life, the sentence was a joke. The jury didn't buy Root's story. They deliberated less than 8 hours and convicted all three defendants. Keenan and Amsler got life plus 75 years. Irwin got 75 years, too. It sounded like they were finished. Then Barry Keenan served just over 4 years, not 45 like the sentence said, just about 4 years in total. A judge later ruled he'd been legally insane at the time of the crime because he'd told the court that God had personally given him the kidnapping plan. Insanity got his sentence sliced down. Joe Amsler and John Irwin each served about 3.5 years. Every one of them was out before the end of the 60s. Then Keenan went home and built a real estate empire. By 1983, his net worth was around $17 million. He was rubbing elbows with the same rich Los Angeles crowd Frank Jr. was trying to survive in. Amsler went back to stunt work, then farming, then died quietly in Virginia in 2006. Irwin more or less vanished after prison. Torrance kept making surf records. Now here's what happened to the kid they took. Frank Jr. spent the next 5 decades trying to convince people he wasn't in on his own kidnapping. Because Gladys Root's publicity stunt story never really left the public. The jury didn't buy it. The FBI destroyed it. But America believed it anyway, because it was juicier. In an interview with The Guardian in 2012, Frank Jr. finally said the quiet thing out loud. That publicity stunt allegation, he said, was a stigma he'd lived with for years. He'd been branded a fraud at 19, and 49 years later that stigma was still there. He never really got the singing career he wanted either. In the late 1980s, when Frank Sr. was slowing down, he asked his son to be his musical director and conductor. Frank Jr. said yes to the job. He spent the next 7 years until his father stepped away from the stage for good, standing in front of the same band that used to be his own dream, waving a stick, making sure his dad sounded good on stage. His whole late career became about singing Sinatra songs at Sinatra tribute shows. Every stage he stepped on, he was still the son. Then, in 1998, Barry Keenan sat down and wrote a letter. Same year, Frank Sr. died. Keenan tried to make things right. He wrote to Frank Jr. He said he wanted to set the record straight about the publicity stunt lie he'd sold in court to save his own skin. He wanted the country to know Frank Jr. hadn't had any idea, wasn't in on it, was just a scared 19-year-old kid who got taken at gunpoint on a Sunday night while eating chicken. By then, Keenan was a rich man in his 50s. He'd had 35 years to think about it. He was also the guy who'd invented the story that had followed Frank Jr. through every review, every biography, every party since he was a teenager. His apology couldn't undo a minute of that. Frank Jr. wouldn't meet with him. On March 16, 2016, Frank Sinatra Jr. died backstage in Daytona Beach, Florida, at the age of 72. He was on a tour called Sinatra Sings Sinatra, doing his father's material, wearing his father's shadow one more night. He died of cardiac arrest. He never got to shake the story. Now here's the part almost nobody talks about. 6 years later, in November of 2022, Barry Keenan wrote one more letter. This one was to the actor John Stamos, who'd spent years with him on a true crime podcast called Snatching Sinatra. The letter opened with this line, "Dear John, by the time you receive this letter, I will have committed suicide.